All right. So we have three components that we need to tackle. And I think it just makes the most sense to start with images. And essentially, what we're looking for is one main image. And then we have a bunch of images that we can click on. And then, of course, once we click on an image, that becomes that main image. Now, I have to be honest in order to save a little bit of time for all the products, these extra images are exactly the same. So, of course, when we talk about that main image, each product has the unique one. But when we talk about those extra images that I would want to only display on a single product page, of course, they will be all the same. Since I thought that adding some unique images for every product is just going to be a bit too time consuming. So we're going to navigate right now to the product images. But one thing that this component is looking for is the images array. So we need to pass it in. And of course, we can call it images. That also makes sense. And I'll just say that, yep, we're passing in images prop into the product images. So now, of course, we can navigate there where we have the product images. And let's think about it. I mean, we have done this already quite a few times. There should be some kind of use state variable that has that main image. And we can use the index. We can say, yeah, first I would want to display the first image. And then as I'm clicking, of course, I'll change that state index. And as I'm changing that index, of course, the value in the main one will also change. So first, I'm just going to get the images out. And just so I can see that there's no trickery in there, I'm going to go with log and then images. Now, we'll have to do a little bit of more functionality in here, and I'll talk about it when we get there. So I'm going to go here. Notice in the beginning, it is undefined, and then it is an array of 5 items. So now what I would want is to set up some kind of use state variable. And by the way, this just imported the icon that I wasn't looking for. So I have the use state, and I would want to set up that main image. And again, this is something we have done already in the earlier projects. So I'm going to go with const and then main. So that is going to be my main image. That's the one that I'm going to display as a bigger image. And by default, it's going to be the first image in my array. So here we go with the function set main, and that one will be equal to use, and then state, and we'll pass in the images that we're getting back. And like I said, I would want to start with 0, correct? Since I would want to display the first image. Now, there's going to be a bit of a gotcha where, remember, initially that value was undefined. I mean, if you don't remember, then again, we would need to go back and comment this out. But initially, this was undefined, and only then we managed to get the array. So the problem here is that I'm setting up my item, the main one, to be equal to the first item in my array, correct? But initially, images is undefined. Remember, it was undefined, and only then we had our array. So I would want to use the ES6 default parameters, where I'm going to say if the images is undefined, then it's just going to be an empty array. So once we save that, notice we're not getting this error. So initially, it is just going to be an empty array, and then eventually, of course, we'll get our images. So that's a start. And then remember, this is going to be our first image. So if you want to console log the main, that should be the object. Now, in the object, what we're looking for, well, it's going to be the URL. This is where the image is sitting. So there's a bunch of other info, but what we're looking for is this URL. And the way we'll set up our return is in the following way. So I'm going to go with wrapper, and then there's going to be two things. There's going to be that main image, and then the div, so the gallery where I'll display all the images. So we're going to go here with img, and then as far as the source, we're going to go with main and then URL. So that's going to be that main property. And remember, on that object, the property we're looking for was URL. And then as far as the name, well, I'm just going to go with some kind of main image like so. Okay, that's going to be the alternative. And then, like I said, I would also want to have my gallery. Now, for time being, I just save and let's see whether we're going to get that main image. And then once we save, notice we have one more error. So why is that happening? Well, now, not only I'm getting the first item, but then from that first item, I'm looking for the URL. So now we will need to update that default value where I'm going to say if the images is undefined, then there's going to be an array with empty object, and I'll just set that URL to be empty string. Again, the only reason why I'm doing that because initially images is undefined, and in here I'm going right away and checking for the property on the object that is actually undefined. So once I save, we should fix everything, and now of course we can see the image. Now in this case, I'm gonna go to the 100, and that's how our image is gonna look like. Now I do want to add a class name for the styling. So we're going to go here with a main. So now, of course, our image is going to be smaller. And after that, I would want to set up my gallery. So there's going to be a div with class of gallery, like so. And I'm going to iterate over my images. So we're going to say map here, and we're iterating over. And now, of course, for every image, I would want to return a smaller one, correct? So every item is going to be represented by the name of image. And I also would want to get the index because that's how we'll control the state over here. Because each image has the index, and by default, I'm showing the first one. That's why I went with 0. But then as I'm clicking on that image, of course, I'll change this value in the state. So I'm going to go with a return. I'm returning. And for now, just use the source here, and we'll set up image. So that's going to be my object. So each and every image has that property. And then, of course, we'll save it. Now, there's going to be some errors, don't worry, meaning some warnings because we didn't set up the key. But the important part is that, of course, we can see the images. Now, at the moment, nothing is happening, but at least we have two things. We have, of course, the main image as well as the gallery of images. And then again, the main image we get by getting the first item from the array and then using the URL property, since that's where the image is sitting. And what few things I would need to add. And as far as the alternative, you know what? Let me just check what was in the main, what was in the object. I would want to double check. So initially, notice we just have this dummy value for the URL, but then eventually, of course, we have all of these ones. And I think I can just use this file name for the alternative. So I'm going to go back and we're going to go for alternative. We're going to use image and then file name. File name. Hopefully the property is exactly the same. Yep. File name. And then also we would need to have a key. Remember, we have a list, of course, in this case. So I'm going to set this equal to the index. And then once I click on the images, now, of course, I would want to change that index, correct? So once I change it, then, of course, this image, the one that I have clicked on, will become that main one. So in the beginning, I'm just looking for this image, the first one, but then, of course, I can pass in this one, the one that I'm clicking on. And the way we do that, we go with on click, and now let's set up our arrow function. And once we click on it, we'll say set main, and we just change that image. So we change the object. Initially, we set up our main image to be our first one, but now I'm just going to say images. So that's my array. And then whatever is the index of this particular image. So if this is 1, then of course I will set the image, which has the index of 1, to be my main one. And I'll save it. And I think I can remove the console log and notice how I can nicely click on images. And then, of course, I'm changing that main one. And then the last thing that I would want to add is the active class. Notice how when I'm clicking on these images, I'm adding a little border around these images. So that just signals that that is the main image that I'm displaying. And the way we can set that up is simply checking whether the image URL matches the URL that is coming from the main. If that is the case, then I know that, of course, this is the image that I'm displaying. So in here, let's go with class name. Again, we'll set up our expression since we need to use a template literal. And I'm just going to check if the image URL, so the one that is coming from this particular item, matches to the main URL. What that means? Well, that means that image, of course, is the main one right now. So we can set up our ternary operator. And if that is the case, I would want to add the active class. If not, then I'm just going to add null. And what you'll notice, and by the way, here, should have spelled this correctly. We have the null, and there it is. Now, first image, of course, has this active class because this is how we set it up over here. And then every time I click, I change that main URL. And as I'm changing that value, well, I'm also getting that a nice border all around. And before we go over the functionality one more time, let me just fix here the CSS issue. And I'm going to go back to single product. And I think the problem is here that it is not products, it is product center. And now we should get nice distance. And of course, now we have it. And one more time. So we have array of images that we pass into the product images component. Then in the product images, we destructure it. And since I would want to have some kind of main image, I set up the use state. So I set up the state value. And by default, I set my first image to be equal to that main image. Now, the problem is going to be that initially it is undefined. That's why we set up default parameters. So if it is undefined, I just say that it is going to be an array with one object with the URL property. Because in here, of course, we're accessing the URL property. Then I have one image, and then I have the gallery of images. So that one image is going to be the main image, whatever it is. Initially, it is first one. And then, of course, we're changing that. We add a little bit of CSS, and then we have the gallery. We iterate over all the images we have in the array, and then it is an object. And then each object has the URL property that points to the image. That's why we can display them. And since I would want to add something for alternative, I add the file name. And also I need to add the index. And then once I click on the image, I use my set main function and I just pass in the image by accessing the array and then passing whatever is the index of that image. So now once I click on it, it becomes that main image. And then lastly, since I would want to showcase, well, which image I'm actually displaying, I just add a nice border around and I do that by conditionally checking. If the image URL matches to the one of main URL, then I know that that's the image. And then we just add this class of active. If not, we have class of null.